Chapter 11, Aggregate Supply and the Phillips Curve. So in this chapter, we're going to learn about two things, the Phillips curve, and with the help of Phillips curve, how we build the aggregate supply curve. So supply is basically supply of goods and services. So Phillips curve tells us the relationship between inflation pi and unemployment u. And it's an inverse relationship. Inflation goes down as unemployment increases. As more and more people are unemployed, inflation goes down. So let's see if this actually makes sense intuitively. So let's say there is a demand for 50 pizzas, right? And there's only one pizza shop. And if the demand for pizzas increase, then that pizza shop will now have to employ more people. Yeah? If it goes from like it used to create 10 pizzas and now going to create 50 pizzas, it's going to need more labor. So the unemployment will go down. So as demand for goods go up, unemployment goes down because more people are employed. They have to make those goods and services to supply. And when they start building those goods and services, they are employed, they will start to demand for more wages. Because let's say you have 10 people making 50 pizzas and you can get 12 people and make those 50 pizzas faster, then those 11th and 12th person will demand more money because they probably just want to do something else, but now you want them to make pizza, so they're going to ask you for more money. So the wages will grow as unemployment goes down because you have less people to choose from and someone else doing something else which is low productive, now they have to come and make pizzas for you. So that makes sense. When you have to make more goods and services, your unemployment goes down. When our unemployment goes down, wages go up, less people to choose from, so they have bargaining power. And when those wages go up, those people making the pizzas, they'll be your customers too. So for you to sell them those pizzas or for you to sell anyone else pizzas, because your cost went up as your wages went up, you're going to increase the size, the price of your pizza. So you're going to say, hey, my pizza is going to cost more money now. So when that happens, when your goods and services become more expensive, inflation goes up. Yeah. So look at this. Reduction in unemployment, increased inflation. And we looked at it from a very simple pizza shop. Make more pizzas, you need more people. You need more people, you got to pay them more. You got to pay them more. You can only pay them more if you increase it increases your cost. You're going to increase your price of goods that you sell. And so the inflation, which is an aggregate basket of goods and services, goes up. So that is the intuition behind this. As unemployment goes up and up, inflation goes down. As unemployment goes down, which is this situation, inflation goes up. So once we understand from intuition and from this person, Phillips, it's a long name of this inventor, but it's behind his name, it's called the Phillips curve. And mathematically, what we just went through the intuition, let's also try to derive it. So inflation has some relationship with unemployment, which we know. And then it's a negative relationship through this intuition. So unemployment is one piece, but U minus UN is the natural unemployment. So U minus UN is probably a better proxy, like what's the unemployment gap? And then instead of relationship, you could just have a constant. And it's a negative one, so we'll do minus W. And then you can say, hey, my inflation also depends on my expectation of inflation. So if I expect my inflation to be higher, then I have to add this new variable pi e, expected inflation. So pi e minus the whole term. And this is the classical Phillips curve. Pi equals pi e minus W, U minus UN. But the modern version of this is saying, hey, the expected inflation is nothing but the inflation of a year back. So pi minus 1. Last year's looking back inflation is your modern Phillips curve. So if you do pi equals pi minus 1 W, U minus UN. And then similarly, if you add to this, hey, my inflation also depends on like some sort of a price shock. If my oil prices go up and I have a positive shock, then I think my inflation is going to go up, right? So there's a positive and a negative shock that I can get. So my inflation equation then comes down to be this. Depends on my expected inflation, which is looking back, 1 pi minus 1, unemployment, price shocks. And then there's this guy called Okun. Okun, he derived a relationship between unemployment and output, unemployment gap and output gap. And there is an inverse correlation as well. As unemployment gap goes down, output goes up. Again, intuitive, but he looked at it and he has derived this equation: u minus un equals 0.5 y minus yp. Right? So a percentage decrease in unemployment gap, u minus un, has a 0.5% decrease, 0.5% decrease in the output. Right? So which is basically saying, hey, if you increase the output by 1%, the unemployment gap goes down as well, right? So the reason why this is so is because when your workers become more productive, not necessarily you will hire more people very quickly. And second, when it becomes more attractive for people to work, you will have more people entering the labor workforce, right? So there is no direct 100% correlation, but it only reduces by 0.5%. Right? So that's an important association. But the key takeaway here is that unemployment gap goes down, production gap goes up. Right? So if we now replace unemployment with Okun's law, then we will have this gamma y minus yp, right? So then we can say, hey, inflation is dependent on my past expectation, output, and my price shock. So if you want to increase inflation, if the expected inflation is high, then inflation would be high. If my output's high, inflation would be high. If my price shock's there, then inflation is going to be high. If my unemployment goes down, inflation is going to be high. So it gives us this relationship, but we just intuitively one by one added to all of these layers, right? So now we know the Phillips curve. We looked at it. If we now combine the Phillips curve with the Okun's law, right? So think about this. Phillips curve is basically saying, hey, when my inflation goes down, my unemployment goes up, right? So that is equation number 1. Okun's law says, hey, when my unemployment goes up, unemployment gap goes up, my output reduces. So that's equation 2. And now if we combine equation 1 and 2, we get the aggregate supply curve, which basically says when my inflation goes down, my output goes down, right? You just combine these two, and that's what it is. When my inflation goes down, my output goes down. When my inflation goes up, output goes up. So this is the aggregate supply curve. So now we have built the relationship between inflation and output supplied, goods and services that are supplied. So this is the short run aggregate supply curve. In the long run, it looks like this. It's a straight line, which basically says, hey, if my economy is running 100% people are employed, and I'm running my factory 100% utilized, then I'm going to have a fixed amount of output no matter what the inflation is. And that's going to be the long run aggregate supply. And we also looked at why this thing goes up, right? Because of this equation. We know aggregate supply goes up. But if you combine these two, then it'll probably look like this. It'll go like this, and then it'll have a curve that goes up. So short run and the long run. So there is a difference between the short run and the long run. In the long run, it's more like a vertical line. Short run, it slopes upwards through this derivation that we just did. And so what are the factors that causes the aggregate supply? Now we looked at aggregate demand. Now we need to understand what changes aggregate supply. So there are two ways in which you can shift the aggregate supply. One way is to shift down, which is to increase it. and one way is to shift up to decrease it. Shifting down is nothing but shifting right? You're going down into the right. Shifting up is down, up into the left, right? So if you want to shift it down, if you want to increase the aggregate supply, there are 4 ways. And remember our Cobb-Douglas function from chapter 3. Output equals productivity, capital K raised to alpha, L raised to 1 minus alpha. So these are all the same equation that can change the aggregate supply. Increase total capital, aggregate supply goes up. Increase labor, aggregate supply goes up. Improve technology, same labor capital ratio will get you more productivity. And reduce unemployment, right? Because L is going to be at the bottom. Remember the capital labor ratio, so this can also be written as KL raised to alpha, right? So reduce unemployment, aggregate supply goes down. And so when aggregate supply goes up in all of these ways, inflation goes down. So that's the key learning. Key learning, increase aggregate supply, inflation goes down. Similarly, if you want to reduce aggregate supply, inflation goes up. How do you reduce it? If inflation increases, aggregate supply reduces. If there's a price shock, with let's say the oil prices, there's a huge shock in terms of the dollar per barrel of oil going up, then aggregate supply goes up, inflation goes up. And if let's say the output gap increases, right, the worker creates more, then inflation would also go up. So there are ways to shift inflation, we look through that. But now let's look at an example. Like let's say you're going through a recession and you're here and you know, hey, you want to, as a country, let's say you had 2007, 2009, United States, and they're going through this recession, and the federal government decides that, hey, we want to reduce unemployment proactively, right? Let's say this was a big number, like 20%, and we want to get it down to 10%. So let's say we want to reduce unemployment. So now we can use all of the things that we've learned to temporarily move unemployment. So we know that, hey, if we want to reduce unemployment, we can increase inflation, right? If we increase inflation, if we are here, and if we go up here, then unemployment will go down. So that's exactly what the governments have done several times with the help of Federal Reserve, the central bank. What they do is they do this thing called quantitative easing, which basically says, hey, I'm going to buy my government securities. And so by that, what they do is they take government securities and put money into the system, increase the money supply. And when money supply increases, people now have more money, so they'll go spend. Banks will, banks could lend more because they might not just increase the money supply, but they can also reduce the reserve ratio. There are many ways in which they can stimulate expansionary policies by increasing the demand. So let's say the government does that. They're like, hey, I want to reduce unemployment. They decide that. So what do? They try to expand and so increase inflation, pump more money into the system. And when they do that, unemployment reduces. We just went through this whole equation. And so then what happens is there's a side effect to this. In the short run, yes, you can reduce the unemployment at a higher inflation. So if inflation was I1, it goes to I2. And so then what happens is that everyone starts feeling comfortable. Oh, we went from 3% to 2%. Inflation went up a little bit. But then what happens is, in the long run, people start expecting the new inflation to be the one that they saw in the last year. So this B all of a sudden becomes the norm. They're like, hey, this inflation is expected. And so then the Phillips curve, which was here before, it just had a move on the curve. It leads to a move, and it leads to a shift of the curve because this becomes the new normal. People start thinking this is the new normal. And so the Phillips curve shifts up. And so the inflation now becomes, to keep at this unnatural lower unemployment rate than what the economy is naturally, that natural equilibrium unemployment, the inflation will keep going out of control. because the expectations would start building in, and it becomes that negative loop. And so the Phillips curves then start shifting until the unemployment comes back to this equilibrium, and at that point inflation would be quite high. So governments trying to stimulate the economy can have a huge downside to inflation expansion. So that's a key learning. So this is the short run Phillips curves, all of these, but as we see, it comes back to the same point and comes back to this natural rate of so this rate, right, where it's at equilibrium, it's a natural non-accelerated, I think, inflation, NAIRU, that's the term, it's called non-accelerated inflation rate unemployment, right? So at this point, at this unemployment rate, there's an equilibrium, meaning the people who had the jobs have the jobs, they have the skills, you're not going way above and beyond and stimulating the economy, and so you will, at a specific unemployment, the inflation would be stable. But if you try to stimulate it way above and beyond, if you're not in the right timing, then it can have these consequences, right? So to fight recession, there is a way in the short run, but in the long run, if the economy doesn't really invest those money into savings and investments, which is the only way to shift the unemployment down in the long run, then this short-term equilibrium will actually get out of control. So short-run Phillips curve is these lines sloping down, but the long run is this curve here. It's a straight line. Long-run Phillips curve, right? It's an equilibrium point, and the only way you shift that is you invest in the economy and have more savings. So we saw this, right? What are the changes in the short run? We can do a bunch of things to reduce unemployment, increase inflation, increase output. But remember this piece, that people have this adaptive expectation of inflation. So it does naturally shift upwards because they think about inflation as backward looking. They look at like, hey, what was my inflation like when it was last year? And so that adaptive expectation of looking at inflation is also called backward looking. So pi e equals pi minus 1. Remember where we substituted pi e equals pi minus 1? This is that adaptive substitution. Cool. So now we know if we want to increase aggregate supply, there are many ways, right? A, K, alpha, L, and then unemployment. But it also reduces inflation. And we now know the aggregate supply curve. This is the short-run aggregate supply curve. This is the long-run aggregate supply curve, straight line. We know the Okun's law right now, and we know the Phillips curve. So now we know aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and how to influence the shifts. Awesome, thanks.